The woods behind my grandparents' house had always been a forbidden zone, an unwritten rule passed down through the family. My mother would warn us every summer, stay out of the woods after dark. Don't go looking for things you don't want to find. As a kid, I thought it was just a ploy to keep me from wandering too far. Now, as an adult, I know better. It started last July when I returned to the old house after my grandmother passed. My grandfather had gone years before, so the house was empty, left to me in the will. It was supposed to be a simple trip, clean out the place, get it ready for sale, and head back to the city. But the first night as I lay in bed, I heard the singing. It was faint, drifting in from the direction of the woods. A child's voice, soft and sweet, carrying a melody I didn't recognize. It stopped me cold. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and there were no children anywhere near this remote, sleepy town. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, maybe an echo of some distant sound. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Words began to form. Come out, where you are. Come out, not so far. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found myself drawn to the edge of the woods. The tree line loomed like a dark wall, the branches tangled and gnarled. The morning sun couldn't pierce the shadows, and the air felt colder near the trees. Something hung in the air, a smell, faint and metallic, like rust. As I stood there, staring into the forest, I noticed something odd. The grass at my feet was flattened in a straight path leading directly into the darkness. It looked like someone or something had dragged heavy footsteps through the field. I should have turned back. I should have walked away right then. But curiosity got the better of me. The path wound deeper into the woods, and the further I went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the underbrush. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A doll hanging from a tree branch. It was old, its face cracked and faded, its dress tattered and gray with dirt. But what caught my attention wasn't the doll itself. It was the way it was tied up. Thin strips of fabric, bright red, vivid against the gray of the doll, held it to the branch like a crude marionette. The red fabric trailed down, disappearing into the ground beneath the tree. I stared at it for a long time, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I noticed the second doll, just a few feet further down the path. Then another. The deeper I went, the more dolls I found. They hung from trees, lay in the dirt, leaned against rocks. Each was bound in red fabric, each pointing in the same direction. By the time I realized where the trail was leading me, it was too late to turn back. The clearing was small, barely more than a patch of open earth surrounded by ancient trees. In the center stood a cabin. It looked abandoned, the wood rotted and covered in moss, the windows shattered, but there was smoke curling from the chimney. I should have run. I know that now. But something compelled me to move closer. The door creaked open before I could touch it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, a sweet and sour stench that made my stomach churn. The walls were lined with shelves, and every inch of those shelves was filled with jars. Inside the jars were things. Shapes I couldn't make sense of. Some looked like small animals, their bodies twisted and bloated. Others were unrecognizable, just lumps of flesh suspended in murky liquid. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table, a doll. This one was new, its porcelain face flawless, its dress a crisp, bright white. Its eyes were closed, its hands folded over its chest like it was waiting for something. The red fabric was wrapped tightly around its limbs, crisscrossing its body in intricate patterns. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. The sound echoed in the small cabin, and suddenly the singing was back. Come out, where you are. The voice was right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The doll on the table was sitting up now, its eyes open and staring straight at me. I don't remember how I got out of that cabin. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the woods, my clothes torn, my hands scratched and bleeding. The path I had followed was gone, replaced by an unbroken stretch of forest floor. That night, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the house or the will. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But the singing followed me. Even now, back in the city, I hear it. Late at night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, the melody drifts through my apartment. Come out, where you are. And every time I hear it, the smell of rust fills the air.
Story number 2.
When I took the night shift at the hospital, I thought the hardest part would be staying awake. I was wrong. The hospital where I work is old, one of those massive brick buildings that has been around for over a century. The kind of place with rumors and stories passed down from generation to generation. Most people dismiss them as urban legends. Nurses hearing footsteps in empty hallways, patients claiming to see someone standing by their bed, rooms where the lights never seemed to work quite right. I didn't believe any of it. At least not at first. My shift started at 10 p.m., a slow night with only a handful of patients. By 2 a.m., the ward was silent except for the soft beeping of monitors. I was sitting at the nurse's station scrolling through my phone when I saw him. A man standing at the end of the hallway. He was pale, almost unnaturally so, and he didn't move. Just stood there, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His hospital gown hung loose on his frame as though it didn't fit. For a moment, I thought he was one of our patients, maybe confused and wandering. "Sir, are you lost?" I called out. He didn't respond. I stood up and took a few steps toward him. "Sir, do you need help?" That's when he turned and walked away. I followed, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. He rounded a corner, and I quickened my pace, but when I reached the corner, the hallway was empty. The air was colder there, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked into the nearby rooms, but they were all empty. Confused, I returned to the nurse's station, chalking it up to a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. But then the call button buzzed. Room 307. I frowned, glancing at the patient log. Room 307 was unoccupied. I checked it myself earlier that evening. Still, the call button flashed insistently on the monitor. With a sigh, I grabbed my clipboard and headed to the room. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Something rancid, like meat left out in the sun. The room was dark except for the pale moonlight streaming through the window. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I stepped inside, reaching for the light switch. As the fluorescent lights flickered to life, I saw him. The man from the hallway was sitting on the bed. Only now he didn't look human. His face was wrong, his features too sharp, his eyes sunken into black pits. His skin had a sickly gray tint, stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth was too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Before I could react, he smiled. The lights flickered again, and he was gone. I stumbled out of the room, my chest tight, my hands shaking. When I looked back, the room was empty, the bed neatly made, the smell gone. But the call button was still buzzing. I didn't finish my shift. I left the hospital that night and never went back. A week later, I got a call from one of my coworkers. She wanted to know why I had transferred room 307's patient to another ward. I told her there was no patient. The room was empty. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You need to check the records." So I did. I logged into the hospital's database, pulled up the files for room 307. The last patient in that room was a man named Arthur Lyle. He had been admitted 10 years ago for surgery. Complications during the procedure led to a massive hemorrhage, and he died in the room. His photo was attached to the file. It was him. The man I saw in the hallway, the man sitting on the bed. I deleted the file and shut the laptop, but I can't stop seeing his face. Every time I close my eyes, I see that smile, like those jagged teeth. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the faint buzz of a call button. Room 307.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. It was quiet, safe, and boring, until the night my sister vanished. Emma was 16 when she disappeared. She'd gone to her friend's house after school and never came home. The police searched everywhere. Forests, lakes, neighboring towns. For weeks, her face was plastered on missing posters, her name whispered in every conversation. But there were no leads, no clues. She was just gone. My parents fell apart after that. My dad buried himself in work, and my mom spent every waking moment searching for Emma, chasing down rumors and dead ends. I was only 12 at the time, and I spent most nights crying myself to sleep, staring at the photo of her on my bedside table. A year passed, then another. Eventually, people stopped talking about Emma. My parents stopped looking. Life moved on, but I couldn't. Something about her disappearance didn't feel right. Then, on the 3rd anniversary of the night she vanished, I heard the knocking. It was around midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when there was a faint tap at my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My bedroom was on the second floor, and there was nothing outside my window but air. Heart pounding, I sat up and stared at the glass. That's when I saw it. A hand. Pale and thin, with long, bony fingers. It pressed against the glass, smearing it with a wet, dark substance. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, a face appeared. It was Emma. Her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. Her skin was deathly white, and her eyes were sunken and black, like twin voids staring straight into me. She smiled, and her lips stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice distorted, like two voices speaking at once. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Please," she said. Her smile grew wider. "Don't you miss me?" I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room, screaming. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and rushed outside, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no handprints on the window, just silence. After that night, things got worse. I started seeing her everywhere. In the mirror when I brushed my teeth, in the reflection of the TV when it was off, standing at the edge of the woods when I walked to school. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared at me with that awful smile. My parents didn't believe me when I told them. They thought it was grief, my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew better. That wasn't Emma. Whatever it was wearing her face like a mask. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She was closer this time, her skin peeling in places, revealing something dark and wet beneath. Her smile was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, and her eyes weren't just black, they were empty. "You miss me," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. "You said you'd never let me go." And then she crawled onto the bed. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. I screamed and she lunged, her hands clawing at my throat. Just as her fingers touched my skin, the door burst open and my dad stormed in. The thing that looked like Emma was gone. After that, my parents sent me to therapy. I stopped talking about her, stopped telling them when I saw her, but she never stopped coming. Last week, I woke up with scratches on my neck, long and deep. And tonight, as I write this, I can hear the tapping again. Tap. Tap, tap, she's at the window.
Story number 4.
When I was a kid, my friends and I used to dare each other to play the elevator game. You've probably heard of it. It's one of those urban legends that's been floating around the internet for years. The rules are simple. You go into an elevator in a building with at least 10 floors and press a specific sequence of buttons. Supposedly, if you do it right, you'll be transported to another dimension. We didn't have any 10-story buildings in our small town, so we never got to try it. But when I moved to the city for college, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew it was just a dumb internet myth, but part of me wanted to see if it was real. There was an old apartment building near campus, run down, with flickering lights and peeling wallpaper. It had 12 floors, which made it perfect for the game. I decided to try it late one night, just for fun. The building was quiet, the lobby empty. I stepped into the elevator, my hands sweating as I pressed the buttons in the exact order I had memorized. 4, 2, 6, 2, 10, 5. When I reached the 5th floor, the doors opened, but no one was there. I hesitated, remembering one of the rules. If a woman gets on at the 5th floor, you're not supposed to look at her or speak to her. But the hallway was empty. I pressed 1 to go back to the lobby. Instead of going down, the elevator began to ascend. I hadn't pressed any other buttons, but the digital display blinked 10, then 11, then 12. When the doors slid open, I was met with darkness. The hallway beyond wasn't lit, and the air smelled stale, like something left to rot. My gut screamed at me to stay inside the elevator, to press the lobby button and leave. But curiosity pulled me forward. I stepped out, my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. The walls were covered in something sticky and black, and the sound of faint whispers tickled my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Then I heard it, a soft tapping coming from the far end of the hallway. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking on a door. Tap, tap, tap. The sound sent chills down my spine. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors had closed. The panel next to it was dark, and no matter how many times I pressed the call button, the elevator didn't return. That's when I saw her, a figure at the end of the hallway. She was standing perfectly still, her back to me, her long hair tangled and matted. She wore a hospital gown, its hem stained with something dark. "Miss?" I called out, my voice shaking. She turned, slowly, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Her face was wrong. Her mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and glistening. She took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. She moved closer, her footsteps making no sound, her grin widening with every step. "Do you want to play a game?" she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, turning corners blindly, desperate to find a stairwell or an exit. But the hallway seemed to stretch forever, twisting and looping back on itself. No matter which direction I went, I kept ending up in front of the same elevator. And she was always there, standing in the hallway, her empty eyes locked on me. Finally, I reached the elevator and slammed the button for the lobby. The doors opened, and I threw myself inside, punching the closed doors button repeatedly. She didn't follow. The elevator began its descent, the hum of the machinery steady and familiar. I pressed my back against the wall, breathing heavily, relief washing over me. But when the doors opened, I wasn't in the lobby. The floor was white and sterile, the walls lined with doors. Behind each door, I could hear faint noises, crying, screaming, laughter. A figure stepped into view at the end of the hallway. It was her. Her grin was impossibly wide now, stretching across her entire face, her teeth sharp and jagged. She raised a hand and pointed at me. "Your turn," she said, her voice echoing in my head. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator began to rise again. I've been riding this elevator for hours now, maybe days. The doors open occasionally, but it's never the lobby. Sometimes it's the dark hallway, sometimes it's the white floor with the doors, and sometimes she's there, waiting. I don't know how to get out, and I don't think I'm alone anymore.
Story number 5.
I never wanted to move into the house. My partner, Anna, fell in love with it the moment we stepped inside, but to me, it felt wrong. The air was heavy, the shadows too deep, even in the middle of the day. But Anna said it had character, and after weeks of house hunting, I gave in. The first few nights were uneventful. We unpacked, got settled, and started making the place our own. The only oddity was the basement. The previous owners had left it completely empty except for a single mirror leaning against the far wall. It was old, its frame ornate and blackened with age. Anna wanted to throw it out, but something about it made me hesitate. "It's creepy," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Yeah," I admitted, "but it's interesting. Let's keep it for now." I wish I hadn't. The first time I noticed something strange, I was doing laundry in the basement. I caught movement in the corner of my eye and turned toward the mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the glass. When I looked closer, it was just my reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. I sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from the basement. I shook Anna awake, but she groaned and turned over. "It's an old house," she mumbled. "Probably pipes or something." I wanted to believe her. I tried to ignore it, but the whispering continued, soft and persistent. The next day, I went back down to the basement, determined to prove it was nothing. The mirror stood there, reflecting the dim light from the single bulb overhead. I stared at it, feeling foolish. And then it blinked. My reflection blinked. But I didn't. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The image in the mirror grinned at me, its smile far too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. I turned and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I told Anna what I saw, but she laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies," she said, shaking her head. But over the next few days, she began to change. At first, it was subtle. She seemed distracted, forgetting things, staring off into space. Then she started spending hours in the basement. I'd find her standing in front of the mirror, unmoving, her eyes glassy. "Anna?" I'd say, touching her shoulder. She'd snap out of it, blinking rapidly. "Sorry," she'd mumble. "I just lost track of time." One night I woke up to find her standing at the foot of the bed, staring down at me. "Anna?" I whispered, my throat dry. She didn't respond. Her face was expressionless, her eyes dark and empty. "Anna, you're scaring me." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a slow, unnatural smile. "It's not Anna," she said, her voice a distorted whisper. I screamed, and she collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. The next morning, she had no memory of what happened. She begged me to leave the house, said she felt like something was watching her, following her. We packed that afternoon. As we were loading the car, I went back inside to grab one last box. The house felt colder, the air thick with dread. I tried to hurry, but something compelled me to look down the basement stairs one last time. The mirror was gone. In its place stood a figure, tall and thin, its body covered in shadows that writhed and twisted like smoke. Its face was pale and featureless, except for a wide, jagged grin. It raised a hand and waved. I slammed the door and ran. We left the house that night, abandoning most of our things. I don't know what that thing was, but I know it wasn't finished with us. Last night, I heard the whispering again. It's in the hallway now.
Story number 6.
I work night shifts at a 24-hour gas station in the middle of nowhere. It's the kind of place where the air always smells faintly of gasoline, and the only sounds at night are the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Most nights are quiet, just the occasional trucker or lost traveler stopping by for gas or snacks. But a few nights ago, something happened that I can't explain. It was around 2 a.m., the dead hour when time feels like it's standing still. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the door chime. I looked up, expecting to see someone walking in, but the store was empty. The door had swung open on its own, the bell jingling faintly in the still air. I got up to check, but there was no one outside, just the empty parking lot bathed in the cold light of the flickering overhead lamp. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my stool. 10 minutes later, the chime rang again. This time, when I looked up, a man was standing just inside the door. I hadn't heard him come in. He was tall, with pale skin and greasy black hair that hung in his face. His clothes were tattered and stained, and he smelled like damp earth. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a smile. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed too dark, too hollow. "Sir?" I said, my voice cracking. Finally, he walked to the counter. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was fighting against invisible strings pulling at his limbs. He placed a crumpled dollar bill on the counter and said, "Pump 6. I glanced out the window. The lot was empty. There was no car at Pump 6, or at any of the pumps. Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. His lips twitched as if he was trying to smile, but the expression never reached his eyes. I rang up the purchase, handed him his receipt, and he shuffled back toward the door. But before he left, he stopped and turned to look at me. "She's watching you," he said, and then he was gone. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. The parking lot was still empty. The man had vanished. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some weirdo messing with me. But then the lights flickered. It started slowly at first, a soft buzz, a dimming of the fluorescent bulbs. Then the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the aisles, casting long, jagged shadows. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound. It was coming from the back of the store, near the storage room. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I edged toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like fingernails raking against metal. When I reached the storage room door, I hesitated. The tapping stopped. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, just rows of shelves filled with cleaning supplies and spare inventory. But then I noticed the vent in the corner of the ceiling. It was open, the metal grate hanging loose. I felt a cold draft brush against my neck, and I spun around. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the end of the aisle, her body unnaturally thin and twisted like something folded into itself. Her skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Her head tilted to the side, her neck bending far too far, and her eyes were solid black, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a low, guttural hiss escaped. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my keys or getting into my car. I just remember driving, the gas station shrinking in my rearview mirror. The next day, I called my boss and quit. I told him I was sick, that I couldn't come back. He didn't seem surprised. "Another one, huh?" he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. He sighed. "That station's got a history. People see things, hear things. It's always worse at night. You're not the first to leave." I didn't ask any more questions. But last night, as I lay in bed, I heard the tapping again. And when I looked out the window, I saw her standing under the street lamp, smiling up at me.
Story number 7.
When I was a kid, I was terrified of my grandmother's house. It wasn't anything specific, no tragic backstory, no ghost stories about the place. It just always felt off. The air was colder there, even in the summer, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. But The worst part was the attic. My grandmother kept it locked, always warning us to stay out. Nothing up there but old junk, she'd say. But at night, I'd hear noises coming from above. The creak of footsteps, the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. I asked her about it once. Rats, she said quickly, her voice tight. But it didn't sound like rats. One summer, when I was about 10, my parents left me at her house for a week. I begged them to take me with them, but they insisted it would be fine. She loves you, they said. It's just a week. The first few days were uneventful, but the nights were unbearable. The noises in the attic seemed louder than usual, footsteps pacing back and forth, and sometimes faint whispers. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway to the attic door. It was locked, as always, but this time, the key was sitting in the lock. My hands trembled as I turned the key and pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs stretching between the beams. For a moment, I felt silly. It really was just junk. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic was a chair. It was old. The wood cracked and splintered, but it wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped in the chair, its head tilted forward, its long hair hanging over its face. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, my breath fogging up in front of me. "Grandma?" I said again, louder this time. The figure twitched. I froze. Slowly it raised its head. It wasn't my grandmother. Its face was pale and sunken, the skin stretched tight over its skull. Its eyes were black, empty pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. And its mouth, it was too wide, filled with jagged teeth, stretched into a grin that didn't reach its eyes. "Found you," it rasped, its voice a hollow whisper. I screamed and bolted down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, my grandmother acted like nothing had happened. She made me pancakes and asked if I'd slept well. When I asked her about the attic, she went quiet. "There's nothing up there," she said firmly, her eyes narrowing. "Stay out of the attic." I wanted to argue, to tell her what I saw, but something in her tone stopped me. The rest of the week passed in a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. When my parents finally came to pick me up, I ran to the car without looking back. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, my parents asked me to help clean out her house. I hadn't been back since that summer, and the thought of going into the attic made my skin crawl. But I had to know. When I opened the attic door, the chair was gone. The boxes and furniture were covered in a thicker layer of dust, like no one had been up there in years. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the wall near the door. 4 words scratched deep into the wood. "It still lives here."
Story number 8.
I never should have taken the job. It seemed perfect at first. Decent pay, flexible hours, and all I had to do was house sit for a wealthy family who traveled constantly. They'd moved to a new city and were waiting to sell their old mansion. The place was beautiful but isolated. It was tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. The family gave me a long list of instructions. Check the locks every night, water the plants, keep the lights on in certain rooms to deter burglars. "And don't go into the basement," the mother said, her voice dropping. "Why not?" I asked, laughing nervously. She didn't smile. "Just don't." That night, I arrived at the house and settled in. It was massive, with high ceilings and ornate furniture, but it felt empty. The kind of empty that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I followed their instructions to the letter, double-checking the locks and turning on the lights. By midnight, I was curled up on the couch watching TV and trying to ignore how quiet it was. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It was soft at first, barely audible. I paused the TV and listened, my heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it was coming from below, the basement. I grabbed my phone and texted the homeowner. "Hey, I'm hearing noises from the basement. Could there be an animal or something down there?" The response came almost immediately. "Do not go into the basement. Stay upstairs. Everything is fine." Fine? It didn't feel fine. The knocking continued, irregular and insistent, as if someone or something was trapped down there. I tried to ignore it, but after an hour, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a hook nearby. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and pulled it open. A gust of cold air hit me, carrying a faint metallic smell. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The light switch didn't work, so I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. The basement was empty, just a concrete floor and stone walls. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. A wooden hatch, bolted shut. The knocking started again, louder now, coming from beneath the hatch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. The knocking stopped. Then a voice. "Please," it whispered, barely audible. "Help me." I froze. The voice sounded weak, desperate. "Who's there?" I asked, taking a step closer. "Help me," it repeated. I reached for the bolts, my mind racing. Someone was trapped down there. I couldn't just leave them. As I slid the first bolt free, the voice changed. "Let me out," it hissed, deeper now, almost inhuman. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The hatch rattled violently, as if something on the other side was throwing itself against it. "Let me out!" the voice roared, shaking the air around me. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs and slamming the door behind me. I texted the homeowner again, my fingers trembling. "There's something in the basement." It was talking. "What's down there?" The reply came minutes later. "You opened the door, didn't you?" I didn't respond. A second message came through. "You need to leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and ran to my car, not bothering to lock the house behind me. As I sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The basement door was open, and standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy, with glowing red eyes. I quit the job the next day. The family never responded to my messages, and when I tried to look them up, I found nothing. No records, no phone numbers, no social media. It was like they'd never existed. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knocking again, and I'm afraid one day it will answer itself.
Story number 9.
The new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. After breaking up with my boyfriend and leaving behind a toxic job, I was ready to rebuild my life. The place was small, but it had charm. A quaint little one-bedroom on the third floor of an old brick building. The landlord seemed nice enough. He only had one rule when he handed me the keys: don't move the mirror in the hallway. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression stayed serious. "It's been there since the building was constructed," he explained. "Just leave it alone." The mirror was large and ornate, its gold frame tarnished with age. It hung directly across from the front door, reflecting the narrow hallway. I didn't see the harm in leaving it where it was, so I shrugged and agreed. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, got into a routine, and started to feel at home. But then, strange things began to happen. It started with small noises, the creak of floorboards when no one was there, the sound of faint whispers in the dead of night. At first, I told myself it was just an old building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One night, as I was locking up before bed, I glanced at the mirror and froze. There was a smudge on the glass, faint but unmistakable. A handprint. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd touched the mirror at any point. It didn't seem likely. Still, I grabbed a cloth and wiped it clean. The next morning, the handprint was back. It was larger this time, and the fingers seemed longer than any human hand. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises in the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. I finally got out of bed and opened the door, expecting to find nothing. But when I looked at the mirror, my heart stopped. The hallway behind me was empty, but in the reflection, a figure stood at the far end. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadow, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to bore into me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I slammed my door shut and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called the landlord. "The mirror," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something wrong with it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I told you not to move it," he said finally. "I didn't," I snapped. "Then don't look at it," he replied, his tone icy. "And whatever you do, don't let it out." "Let what out?" I demanded, but he hung up. That night, the noises were louder, footsteps, whispers, and something else, a low, guttural growl. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, too afraid to leave. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, my bedroom door was open, and the mirror was inside the room. It was leaning against the wall, facing my bed. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was back, closer this time, its skeletal hands pressed against the inside of the glass. its head tilted back, its mouth stretching into a wide, jagged grin. And then it moved. Its hand slid slowly down the surface of the mirror, leaving streaks as it went. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord again. "You moved the mirror," I said, my voice shaking. "No," he replied, his tone grave. "You did." I didn't stay to find out what he meant. I grabbed my things and left the apartment that morning, never looking back. The landlord never tried to contact me, and when I drove past the building weeks later, the windows of my old apartment were dark. But last night, I found a mirror in my new place. I didn't put it there, and when I looked into it, I saw the hallway of my old apartment. The figure was waiting.